Hello everyone, I'm Joey from Lock Props, and today I'm going to be showing you how I put together Zelda's Tristaff from the Echoes of Wisdom. This is going to be a little bit different than my normal videos. This is not going to be an EVA foam, but a 3D printed model. I purchased the file from Illustrious Models, and the link is going to be down in the description below, as well as all my affiliate links for any of the tools and materials that I use in this build. And if you guys happen to use those affiliate links down below, it helps out this channel and it supports it, so thank you so much.
After purchasing the files, I'll go ahead and open up the slicer, which is Litchi Slicer. I'll go to Add Files and I'll add them in one by one. This part will be a brief overview about what I do for my resin printer, and of course every single printer and every single person's process is going to be a lot different. So anyway, this is just how I do it. So I selected on the pommel of the version 2, the longer version of the staff, and I plopped it into the slicer, and now what I need to do is I need to rotate it and orient it in a way that can print properly on the bed. Nice thing about this model is that it already has holes for the dowels that you're going to be using later. So when it comes to my models, I'll go ahead and put them at a slight angle. When it comes to my resin printer, it doesn't like it when there is something that is parallel with the build plate, so I have to do it at a slant like this. I found the next piece that should connect to the pommel, and I added that in there too and spaced them out. Now, since I want this prop to be a little bit on the lighter side, I need to hollow it. Once I'm done moving them in the layout section, I'll go ahead and go on to the next part, which is the prepare. Over on the left side of the screen, there is a hollow button. We're going to go ahead and go there first. With the pommel currently selected because it is blue, I'm going to go ahead and make that one hollowed out. You'll see the size and the diameter of my settings on the right side of the screen here. I see that it's the correct settings that I like for the Hollow 3D, and now I'm going to go ahead and hit add and update while I have something selected in blue. I do this for both of the props, and when I do this, it looks like I have done nothing, but basically on the inside, it has completely hollowed everything and left a thickness wall, which is about 2.5 millimeters. But the problem is that when this is hollowed and you try and build it like it is right now, you're creating a strong suction cup against your bed, and it will cause it to rip off from the bed and stick to the FEP sheet. So to circumvent that, we're going to create some holes in the models. On the other side here where it's all yellowed, that's the bottom piece of the file, and I'm going to go ahead and place a couple of those holes right there. When you have these holes in, it won't create a pocket, and that's what is causing it to stick to the FEP sheet. So when you have these in place and you have them multiple throughout the entire prop, you should be okay. There is a little bit of cleanup that you have to do afterwards, but I think that a lighter prop is going to be a lot better for you in the long run. What I'll typically do is I'll put these holes down at the bottom where they're not going to be seen and I don't have to cover those up. But then I also place a few of them on the sides and then at the top of the other side, just to make sure that I have the best possibility of no suction cups while during this build. Two more things before we can go ahead and export this. First thing, we're going to go ahead and create a raft. On the left side, I'm going to go ahead and select on raft. I like to select on the raft that's the same size as the piece that's going to be on the bed. Now you'll see there's a small thin plate of resin that's going to be down at the bottom. That's going to be where the model is going to be sitting on top of with the supports. Next, we'll go ahead and add the supports. Typically for my props, I don't like using the light ones because they're just too light and they tend to just break off. I'll only use the light ones for miniatures. So I typically just stay with the medium size. The auto generate is actually really good. I rarely ever have to go in and touch up some of it, so I just let it do its thing. Once we're good, we're going to go ahead and export it to our flash drive. So I'll go through piece by piece and do the exact same process with all the other pieces of the Tristaff. Some of the pieces were small enough that I was able to fit multiple onto the bed sheet, which is great, but then like the head over here, I was not able to fit anything else onto it, so I just had to let it do its thing. So after they fully print, I need to take them off of the bed sheet. Remember, whenever working with resin, make sure that you're wearing a respirator, goggles, and gloves. I'll take my trusty spatula and start peeling them off of the bed sheet. Once I peel them off, I clean up the bed, and then I'll put it right back onto the printer and start the next print. That way you have no time wasted and it's continuously going. Also, I'm spraying everything down to pre-clean it with isopropyl alcohol, about 70 to 99%. whatever I have on hand at the time. I'll go ahead and start taking off these supports. Kind of have to break it off one by one to slowly get it off. Once they're free from the supports, I'll go ahead and toss them into the wash and cure station. I'll leave them in there for probably about 10 to 15 minutes. If you find that a raft is really hard to get off with the supports, use some cutters to cut the raft and it will start breaking it off piece by piece, and that is a lot easier than trying to do it all at once. After the pieces have been fully washed, I go ahead and spray them with more isopropyl alcohol and clean them up. Before I put them in the curing machine, I make sure that they are 100% dried before this happens. Dry of any alcohol and dry of any resin. So because there's the holes, I'll leave them on the paper towel for a couple of hours to slowly let all the liquid drain out. Once they're dried, I'll go ahead and put them into the curing machine. When you have a curing machine, you really don't need to have them go for too long. If you have the curing machine go on for too long, resin will become brittle. So make sure that you take a look at whatever resin that you're using, because the cure times typically are on a sheet somewhere online. Now we have all the pieces clean, cured, and dried. But now we have to clean up the holes and the support divots. For the big holes, we'll go ahead and use some baby powder and we'll mix it with some resin. This will create a paste, so then that way we can cover up the holes quickly. We'll apply it with the mixing stick and then we'll also scrape off as much as we can. This way this isn't more resin that we have to sand down later. Then I'll use this UV flashlight to cure the resin immediately. For the small divots, we can use just normal resin and brush it on. I sometimes will apply another layer, cure it, and then sand it down. For these little divots where the holes are, if you load up your brush with a lot of the liquid resin, you can actually just apply just a drop of it using the corner of the brush, and it will pretty much fill in the rest of it. So I'll keep adding the liquid resin until I feel like all of the divots have been fully filled. I'll keep doing this process until I feel like that it's at a pretty good spot where if I do a light sanding to it, then it should be pretty even. After the resin has cured, I want to make sure that I wash it off before I start sanding it. So I grabbed some more isopropyl alcohol, sprayed it on, and then wiped it off. I'll start off with 150 grit sandpaper. I sand down to a point where I feel like I've gotten it pretty smooth, and then I'll spray on some more of the alcohol to wipe away some of it, so then that way I can see where else I need to sand. Once I feel like we're kind of in a good spot, that's when I go up to a higher grit sandpaper. If I need to add more resin, I'll do this part now. Since I have the orbital sander, this will be a lot easier for me, so I'll go ahead and just use that to sand it down. After sanding for about 5 minutes at 240 grit, this is where I got. Eventually I'll go up to 600 grit for the orbital sander. By brushing on the pure resin and then curing it right afterwards, you're kind of making extra layers, so then that way when you go back to sand it, it should be pretty level. For this process, it was a lot of adding the resin, curing it, sanding it down, and then seeing if I needed to add some more resin in certain areas that still needed it. So I completed this process until the rest of it was filled in, or to a point where I felt like it was pretty smooth. Here's a little mini montage of me going through the rest of the pieces. Also, another way to check your work, if you spray it with some water and then you can see how smooth it may become as you're wiping it off. But for the more intricate areas, I had to go back to hand sanding since the sander wasn't able to sand on the inside of the head or to get into nooks and crannies of the swirls. Now we can start piecing together the parts. I got 3 dowels that are 3/8 inch by 48 inches, 2 for the inner channels and 1 for the cut up at the headpiece. You'll see what I mean in a minute. Starbond sent me these 2-part epoxy to try out, and it was a great adhesive to work with, and the set time was about 5 minutes. I mixed both parts A and B into a 1:1 ratio, mixed it up with the silicone stick that came in the box, and applied it on the inside of the channels, and on the face of the side where they're going to be glued together and meeting. I put some more epoxy on the dowels and slid them in. While I was racing against the clock, I grabbed the next part that was supposed to be connected to the base and then slid them on. During this point, it was sliding around a little bit, so I had to hold it in place for a few minutes before it set. Depending on the seam line, I can get away with just brushing on the liquid resin, curing it, maybe adding another layer, then sanding it down until I don't see a seam line. Some of the seams have a larger gap and we'll have to use the baby powder and resin mix to fill it in. The same process that we did with the holes. We will put the next section on and make sure it looks like it connects. Since the model pieces widen when they go up the staff, you can see which one is next pretty easily. Once I found out which one was next, I mixed the epoxy again, put it on the dowels and the face of the piece and put it in place and held it for a few minutes. I repeated this process until I got to the base of the head. I tried filling in this seam with just the resin, but it was too deep, so I had to use the paste. I put it all the way around and scraped off most of it, cured it, washed it, then began sanding with 150 grit. This was the same process that I did for the rest of the seams throughout the rest of the build. Sometimes I had to add a light layer of the liquid resin, cure it, and then sand it in order to fully make sure that I could not see any more seams. For the headpiece, I had to use the third dowel to cut down. After measuring the inside of the channel, I had to cut out two pieces that were about 4 inches or 100 millimeters. Once I had the small piece cut out, I butted it up against the dowel, I made my mark, and then I cut it out again, making the other dowel that goes to the other wing of the head. Before inserting a dowel, I took a flathead screwdriver and cleaned out the channel with the supports that may still be in there. I did a test fit before mixing together more epoxy. Once I knew it fit, I put the epoxy into the channel, the bottom and the top of the dowel, and on the face of the print. Then I held them down for about 5 minutes. Cleaning the head took the longest amount of time since I was not able to use the sander for it, and I had to do everything by hand. I had to be careful that I didn't put pressure on the other side and risk cracking it. I recommend to make one side, fill the seams, sand it, then build the other side. This way one side is much easier to sand and the other wing isn't in the way. Once I got one of the wings on, I repeated the same process with the other side. When putting the head onto the dowels, I had to cut off a portion to have the pieces slot in properly. I put the head on, I made a mark where the face and the head stops. That will show me the length of the dowel that I will need to keep for the bottom part, which ended up being about 35.5 millimeters or 1.4 inches. So I measured 35 millimeters from the base, made my mark with a Sharpie, and then I cut it off using my multi-tool. I made a test fit just to verify that I didn't need to cut off anymore, and it looks like I'm good. I mixed some more epoxy, slathered it on, and then put the head into place. I had some extra epoxy, so I put it where the seam line was. After fully curing, I sanded it down, and it pretty much did the same thing as the paste. Also, I hope this goes without saying, but please wear a respirator as you're sanding resin or any epoxy. This is not stuff that you want to breathe in at all. Once fully done, I got a tack cloth to take off any extra dust before painting. I sprayed on a couple of light coats of filler primer. This is a great way to see where I need to sand, and if there's any seam lines that I still need to touch up. Because of the shape of the prop, I had to paint the head and the pommel first. So when I went to paint the middle part, I could lean the prop up against the wall while the middle part was drying. But with the head and pommel, I have to paint one side, then let it hang over a table while it dries. Luckily, my table is short enough that I can paint the top and the bottom, leave it right in the middle of the work table to let it dry. Once the head and the tail were dried, I painted the middle of the staff. I leaned it up against the wall with a little microfiber cloth to keep it from getting scratched up, and then I came back to it about 24 hours later. Filler primer isn't smooth right off the bat, so I need to sand it a little. I wet sanded using 600 grit, then went to 1000. It's only just a couple passes. Now I can mix the paint. You can honestly use any yellow or green spray can that you like, anything that matches what the reference photo is. But I'm going to make it harder for myself and airbrush it, because I like to torture myself. In a container, I mix opaque white and opaque yellow, 1-to-1 mix, then I added about 10% of the reducer, then added 10% of the UVLS satin. I mixed the paint the same way I did as the yellow with the green. I did a 1-to-1 mix with the green and the white, 10% of the reducer, and then about 10% of the satin after that. I would definitely recommend to do a scale for this unless you can eyeball it. I eventually had to just switch over to the scale because I wasn't getting my mixture right. I started off with the yellow and I put it in my airbrush and I spray painted the head first. Here's a shot of how I had to dry it. Just to protect the paint a little, I applied more of the UVLS satin onto the top. The next morning the head was completely dried, so I began to start painting the middle part. I put the rod on top of my desk while I was holding the head portion and began painting all the way down until the point where I would think that the green starts mixing in with the yellow. I want to practice with shadowing with my airbrush, so with the same yellow that I had created, I applied a few drops of the transparent brown into the mixture, so then that way I had a darker hue. I applied this into the areas that I feel like that possible dirt might build up, or just areas that I think a shadow would be cast. I just kind of eyeballed it to the point where I felt like it was okay. I didn't want to overdo it. Now we can start applying the green. I set the base of the prop onto my table and began painting upward. I had the bottom part be the most vibrant as it started to fade going up the rod. I laid out some microfiber cloths and put it down on the table so it can dry. I also wanted to add that shadow effect to the green down at the bottom too, so I grabbed the same transparent brown, added a few drops to it, and began adding it into the recesses of the rod. I applied some more UVLS satin to the rest of it just to protect that paint, and then I let it dry. Now I'm done.
Now, I'm not going to be cosplaying as Zelda, but my friend Sea Salt Cosplay is, and I'm going to go ahead and put her Instagram tag down here for you so then that way you can see what the full build looks like. I know I said that the next video was supposed to be Deadpool's katanas, and don't worry, that's still coming up. I think that's going to be the next video after this. When that goes live, I'm going to go ahead and put it right here for you so then that way you can watch it now.
That's nasty.